So I know I said I was done with weapon tutorials, but someone had a good question which they left on one of my recent videos asking about the edge marking process that I go through using the Hard Ops add-on. And that's all these little blue edges here. Now, when I'm doing my high poly modeling, these blue edges are meant to add a bevel edge weight, which means when I add the bevel modifier and set the limit method to weight, all of these edges will receive a small bevel, which means when I add a subdivision modifier, which greatly increases the amount of geometry and then smooths out the rest of the surfaces, these edges will still retain their form because of that bevel. But then I went back and I looked at some of the past projects I did, such as this one, and I realized I was doing it wrong. Not when it comes to my high poly, but when it comes to my low poly, which I'll bring up right here. Now, this is my low poly model, and this is after everything has been completed. I've UV unwrapped this entire model, and if I go to the material preview viewport, you can see that I even have the textures that I created in Substance Painter. But there is kind of a crucial step that I messed up on, and you know what? I was really kind of missing the point of why Hard Ops is so integral to the game asset workflow, especially when it comes to hard surface props. And I know that whenever I'm talking about Hard Ops, there's a portion of my audience who is thinking, really? Booleans and sub-D workflow, and I have to do all that cleanup. No, Hard Ops gives you quick access to a number of tools that I find super instrumental in the game asset design workflow. So to talk about the mistake that I made and the step that I missed, I really didn't start realizing it until I made the FPS arms tutorials in which I was using this weapon, and then I really saw the issue, especially when I brought this into Unreal Engine. Now, you might have noticed a little bit of it when I just brought up the low poly collection, but you know what? I'll zoom in on some of the more glaring errors. And I quite literally mean glaring because there are some major shading issues on this model. Now, if I'm just rotating this HDR here, you can see a bunch of weird sort of warping and stretching to the way that the normals and the lighting is casting over the surface of this model right here. And if I go around the model, you'll probably find a few areas where there's some very odd shading, especially around anywhere that there's any sharp edges or cuts in the geometry. And if I go to some other areas, you know, it might look okay. You might notice a little bit of some odd shading going on, but then the rest of it looks pretty normal, as opposed to if I were to go out of the material shading viewport, and you'll see just kind of the smooth Phong shading mess that you'll usually apply to your model by going from the standard flat shading to smooth shading. But if you're in any way already experienced with making hard surface assets, then you're probably just kind of chuckling because you see the error that I don't have any hardened normals on this model, or anywhere on my model. If you're coming from Autodesk, you're probably like, well, where are all your smoothing groups? And yeah, apparently it didn't click for me when I was doing this model, but now I realize just how much Hard Ops was trying to help me along so that I wouldn't make a mistake like this. Because if I go ahead and tab into edit mode, and I'm going to go to the viewport overlays and just disable the seams, which are the red cut lines, and now you can see that I still have all the blue weighted edges from my high poly model. So if I go ahead and explain, basically anytime you add sharpen or bevel or one of these things from the Hard Ops menu that has C# enabled, C# is basically Master Xeon's genius way of fine-tuning your model with all the settings you should ideally want when you're working on any sort of hard surface design. Now, my issue is, and I don't even know why I was doing this, but apparently at some point I was either going into my operations and clearing all the sharps, or I was going into my object data properties and I had disabled auto smooth, which is automatically enabled anytime you use one of these C# modifiers used from Hard Ops. Either that, or I was just using more of a vanilla Blender modeling method, which doesn't automatically enable things like auto smooth, once again bringing up why I like using this add-on. So what we're left with on my model is just simply smooth shading. Now, having all smooth shading might be more desirable for when you're working on organic concepts, such as nature assets or characters. But for hard surface designs, well, hard surface designs usually have a number of hard edges. However, this apparently did click for me later at some point when I was working on the BRN10 model, because if I go to areas where you can see a cutout in the geometry, it is pretty much free of any weird shading issues or any odd clipping or pinching in any area. And that's mainly because, yeah, if I go into edit mode, once again I'll disable the seams, you can see that I retained all of the weighted edges, and if I go to my object data properties, they all have auto smooth enabled. And yet I had constantly run into issues whenever I was modeling any sort of geometry that had issues like this, and I was completely unable to figure out why I was getting so many shading errors. But going back to the bullpup shotgun, let's talk a little bit about why we use auto smooth and how you should be using it. And this is really a good model to use as an example because there are a lot of areas in which you would have to closely examine your reference to decide whether it's best to use a sharpened edge, an edge loop to provide more of a gradation to the normal, or a bevel to create more of a smooth transition. So if I go ahead and I select this part of the weapon and I enable auto smooth uses a simple angle limit method to decide which edges receive a hardened sharp normal. However, you can also manually set edges to be sharp by going into edit mode. Let's say we select this edge loop right here. We can hit Ctrl E to bring up our edge options and then go to mark sharp. And if we go out of edit mode, you can see how that sharp normal is affecting our model. So if we go ahead back into edit mode and we just undo that real quick, now if I select everything, I'm just going to remove the marks that I have, and I'm going to increase this limit angle method to 180, and now you can see that we basically have the same thing as smooth shading, as there are obviously no edges that go past a 180 degree limit threshold. So in previous videos, when you've seen me marking edges using the HardOps add-on, that was applying two operations, a mark sharp and an edge bevel weight. However, if I were to select this edge loop again, and I hit Ctrl E to bring up my edge menu, and I just added an edge bevel weight, I'll drag off to give that a factor of 1, which gives us that blue line, meaning that this edge will receive a bevel from the bevel modifier. However, if I go out of edit mode, you can see that it hasn't received any hardened normal. As where if I selected this edge and I went to my edge menu and I selected mark sharp, that is hardening the normal. And if I go and I select this edge and I hit Q to bring up my HardOps menu and I use the mark option right here, then that's applying both operations, both edge bevel weight and a mark sharp. Next, I'm going to go to this back part of the weapons enclosure where we're getting a lot of pretty bad shading errors. Now, one thing I can do is I can actually access Auto Smooth from the HardOps menu by tapping Q and going down to Mesh Tools. Now I can go to Auto Smooth, and here I can actually control the limit angle by scrolling up and down on my mouse wheel. And I'm actually going to go all the way up to about 120 degrees. And like that, you can see it takes care of a lot of the bad shading errors that we were having. And likewise, if I go into edit mode, you can see that there's already a number of edge weights set on this piece of the model. But why did I set the angle on the Auto Smooth limit method so high? Well, you see this part is made out of sort of a reinforced PVC plastic. There's a lot of sharp corners in here that I actually don't want it to receive a sharpened normal, such as this little lip right here. Now, on my reference, there is actually a bit of a smooth transition on this part as it's made out of plastic. It's not a hard metal corner. So if I were to add a bevel weight around this lip right here, it would also receive a hardened normal. So instead, I give it a supporting edge loop to create more of a gradation to the normal instead of just a hard edge. So I'm going to real quick go throughout all the parts of my model and just enable Auto Smooth. Now I'll adjust and tweak the limit method on each part, but if you want, you can always just set it to 180 degrees and manually set all the edges that you want to mark as sharp. Now, generally when you're marking edges, you want them to be a complete loop. Not that they have to be a traditional edge loop, but you want it to be an interconnected chain of vertices in some way or another. If you have a series of edges that are marked as sharp and then it just ends, then you're probably going to get some slightly noticeable shading errors like you'll see here at the end on the pistol grip of the weapon. Once again, I just adjust the angle limit on the auto smooth until that hard edge goes away. So with this whole process complete, this is more ideally how your 3D hard surface low poly assets should look like before you go ahead to the process of UV unwrapping and texture baking. However, if you're like me and you already baked out all your textures and even created your materials, well, you're gonna have to go back and rebake all your texture sets. That's because adjusting the normals on the low poly is gonna cause a lot of skewing to the previous normal map that you created. For me, at least, this process is pretty simple. All I have to do is go back into Substance Painter and bake out another normal map. Then I can reapply all the other normal details, which I have saved in a separate collection, and export my texture sets again, and like that, all my shading errors are solved. So going back to Blender, we have solved the shading issues on our low poly, and now our textures look better than they did before. And if we go to Unreal Engine, we'll actually create a quick side-by-side of the old version to the new version, and you can see that we have solved many of the shading errors, most notably that little cutout to the rear of the enclosure. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you found some part of this video useful. If you had technical difficulties with anything covered in this video, feel free to leave a comment below or consider joining my Discord server, where we have a community of awesome people who would be more than willing to help you with whatever issues you're having with Blender or 3D modeling. Also, I recently created a community challenge section in my Discord, and about the time that this video is going live, I will also be posting a new theme in there, and there will be a small prize to go along with that, so please consider checking that out as well. Otherwise, good luck with your respective projects, like and subscribe.